Professor Saxena,
Excuse me, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but you will get 12 to 15 minutes for your presentation, and the buzzer will ring at around 12 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that instruction. And thank you, Professor Saxena, for opening up the panel on technology and democracy. I'll be presenting on this concept of eco-development and how it democratizes expertise in India's nuclear order. And to essentially track this notion of eco-development, it's important to understand what India means by self-reliance, because self-reliance is the concept that leads to the making of eco-development in the international order. Self-reliance has India's, India's nuclear order to an extent that when Prime Minister Narendra Modi came into power in 2014, he visited the Baba Atomic Research Center and praised India's nuclear sector for its self-reliant endeavors and for the success of its commercial operations. Jumping on to 2022, this notion of self-reliance is over the face of COVID has taken the face of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So much so that, and Atmanirbhar Bharat is being equated with Gandhian notion of Swadeshi movement. So when self-reliance is getting appropriated by different thought traditions, it's important to understand where does self-reliance come from and what the history is. We are at that critical juncture to understand that. And that is partly what I'm trying to do, and what the notion of self-reliance that Indian state policy has had for over 100 years, including the freedom struggle, how that kind of affects democratization of expertise. Despite this long history, there is a sense within Indian social science scholarship, right, that self-reliance means total autonomy and indigenous control of premises of nuclear facilities, of scientific and technological premises. But this they say it is a rhetorical claim, or it is a false promise, it's a mantra. These are the different words that are thrown around self-reliance, because India has shown so much more reliance on Canada, with UK, with US, with Russia, with France, in terms of developing its nuclear technologies. When it has shown reliance on foreign countries, how it is self-reliant is the question they ask. But really, is self-reliance about not having foreign dependency? Even Gandhi, in his notion of developing self-reliance, says that interdependency with neighbors is necessary in some places, right? So where does this misunderstanding in social sciences come from is also what I'm responding to. So in that sense, first we will kind of see self-reliance in India's nuclear order, and how it multiplied into technological self-reliance, economic self-reliance, ecological self-reliance. I'll not be able to go into developmental self-reliance, and how this multiplication into ecological self-reliance, what that means for the fish in Kudankulam, for the fishermen in fishing community in Kudankulam, for protecting seas by democratization of expertise. When self-reliance mutated into these concepts, right, it became so malleable that people who were meaning it in different ways. Some people meant that we need more foreign dependency for self-reliance. Some people meant that we need more indigenous industrialization within India, using Indian manpower, using Indian skill. It was they made the concept so plastic, and the plasticity of the concept was so high that it was used by opposing context and opposing actors. To trace these, to trace the notion of self-reliance, how it comes, whether it is a continuum from, whether today's Atmanirbhar Bharat is a continuum from past Gandhi's notion of self-reliance, produces like kind of a continuous tale from post-colonial, from our colonial struggle, from our post-colonial struggle, where we developed this concept. But Anne Laura Stoller, when she says, when you analyze colonialism, you have to analyze it not for continuum or for disruptions. Right? Did we move away from self-reliance, Gandhi's notion of self-reliance, not for disruption, but rather as recursive? Like this concept keep recurring in India's Indian and scientific science and in India's science and technological development. So she's asking us to look how when the concept recurred, it folded back on itself and revealed new surfaces, right? When you see that animation, it's folding onto itself and it's revealing a newer surface. So every time it was revealing a newer surface, it was a variant of self-reliance. And then it is revealing a newer surface. What happens is the older surfaces get occluded. right? Think of it as, and this is where she says, focus on occluded histories that have disappeared due to partial reinscription, modified displacement, and amplified recuperation of concepts in that concerns post-colonialism and colonialism. So think of occlusion as a line drawn in the construction of an image that disappeared into the image. So what we have is this wider notion of self-reliance, but the line that drew the stories that made this self-reliance was completely kind of concealed under this notion of self-reliance as, autonomy, total autonomy. Where does all of this come from, right? When they disappear, they kind of don't go away. They're still in the structure, they're still in the architecture, the conceptual, epistemic, and political architecture of colonialism. Why this happens is that sociologists, when they're developing concepts, right, they kind of, feminist scholar Dorothy Smith says that they kind of repress the presence and working of underlying relations. In India, self-reliance was mediated by three relations, the relations between three elements. One is technoscience, how it is going to be used in development, and how that will keep us from recolonization, how that will liberate us from colonialism. That is what, this was constantly reworked, and when it was reworked, it created the concept itself stayed self-reliance, but when it was reworked by different parties, it created different variants, and we'll go into the variants now. Self-reliance and its histories, right? The Swadeshi movement is one of the earliest articulation of self-reliance. It was I'm going to span a period of 1890s to now, so it's going to be wide. And during the Swadeshi movement, there was a call for economic boycott. Some people called for economic boycott of foreign goods, and as we know, Gandhi called for economic boycott of machine-made goods, right? So when this economic boycott was happening, already before the economic boycott, within the Swadeshi nationalists, Satish Chandra Mukherjee, who Dhruv Raina and Irfan Habib calls as the apostle of self-reliant movement in India, of Swadeshi movement in India. He said that science dark side, or that science has produced this sociologically unsound factory system, is because it has encountered Christianity, which is an unphilosophical religion. But when we use science in India, we will use it. It will encounter Hindu spirituality, which is a philosophical religion, and so we will not be producing this kind of unsound factory systems here. So that's what he says in some ways. So what happens is that this kind of cultural revivalism of Hinduism, right, and putting in conversation with science led to an internalization of the superiority of scientific rationality. Right? Science can take India out of its own darkness, and science can itself be taken out of its darkness on its encounter with India. Right? And so P.C. Ray goes on to say that this kind of cultural revivalism, if my countrymen were to follow it, they will regain their own position in the intellectual hierarchy of nature. Of nations. Amongst all the nations, we will be the intellectually superior, or we will regain our position in that. So this came from what Dhruv Raina and Irfan Habib says is a deep colonial anxiety that we are intellectually inadequate, and science is required for us to regain that position, right? So, but Gandhi was on the other hand, and these people went on to create technical education, the Council of Technical Education, and they went on to create many other, institutes for technical education to create the Indian manpower with scientific expertise. While on the other side, you have Gandhi, who is talking about, Gandhi is talking about Swaraj, and Swaraj being the heart of Swadeshi, and Swadeshi being the heart of Swaraj. And this Swadeshi for Gandhi meant that to move away from machine-made goods, and this will lead to growing self-reliance, right? Using this weight of self-reliance, right? You see the difference between the Swadeshi movement and Gandhi's articulation of self-reliance. They went on to create machine-made goods in India, but Gandhi was against machine-made goods to an extent. He was calling for appropriate technology. This basically this is the weight with which, after internalizing science superiority in our psyche, we go on to make technology in India for the nation development. This is the psychopathological relations of colonialism that worked out. So this is the psychopathological relations of colonialism creates a duress in India's nuclear order and India's scientific and technological development as well, so much so that it was Nehru and all thought that scientists with vision and expert knowledge can only uplift India from its problems of illiteracy, superstition, deadening custom and tradition. So in that way, the scientists got a lot of place in this sector. And what happens further is that the technologies were imagined to put us on the intellectual hierarchy of nation. Technologies were imagined to take the standard of living of people to a level comparable to that of the industrially advanced countries. So Homi Bhabha says that can be done through only the large-scale utilization of nuclear energy, right? But when nuclear energy was organized, the general public who had to meet the standards of advanced countries, right? That was the aim. The general public was a benefactor of this nuclear energy. They were never agents who were epistemic agents, because what happens when the Atomic Energy Bill is placed in the Constitutional Assembly of India, they say that you can carry out atomic operations in a public and non-secretive way. That itself is non-democratic. And there are people who are critiquing and saying that it should be circulated for public opinion, and then they come back and say, no, it only applies to a limited set of scientific experts with vision, and so we don't have to open it up for people in general. So this is the context behind which all of this is happening. And Homi Bhabha also realized that to do this advancement, we cannot rely on foreign countries for fuel, for uranium. And uranium exploration was very nascent at that stage, right? So we have to create our own, mechanism for this. And in this, that's why he creates this 3-stage, nuclear fuel program, which starts from a uranium-based fuel cycle, and through a lot of process, it extracts plutonium, reprocesses the uranium used in the first phase in the existing reactors in our country today, and it kind of like extracts plutonium by reprocessing. It is the same plutonium that is also used for weapon production. Reprocessing is not encouraged in the international nuclear proliferation regime because it can be used for weapon production. So you go on to dependent on thorium. Right? Why? Because India has, by reprocessing, you extract plutonium and then you put it in the fast breeder reactor, and that will generate a fuel that is useful for kickstarting our thorium-based nuclear reactor. India has 1/3 of global thorium resources, the Kerala beach sands. Right? And that is why they wanted to make this shift. But this reprocessing was always a problem internationally. Why India is doing that? So India had to organize indigenous industrialization of nuclear energy because the foreign countries who supplied us fuel basically wanted us to send the fuel back to them. In 1955, under the Colombo Plan, when we collaborate with Canada for the Cyrus reactor, they say that you send back the fuel to us. And Bhabha totally was like, no, we are not going to send back the fuel to us, thank you. We are not going to send back the fuel to you. We need the sovereignty over the fuel, absolute ownership of the fuel, right? And this is a time, this story is told at a time of, and we come to the first notion of technological self-reliance, in a time of in the 1970s, when Anderson says India has a war over self-reliance, what self-reliance means, and it is India's own cultural revolution, right? You see the Cyrus reactor that I mentioned, that was used, that was the reactor from which the plutonium for the first atomic bomb was made. In 1974, we detonated, right? That was a time when we were having the cultural revolution. So when that happened, many people said that it has put us at par with most highly developed nation. Now you see how it recurs, the sentiment of being on par with intellectually, advanced nation. It recurs. So when it recurs, and they are saying that we have achieved something, the nuclear and space technology in the country has put us in this on par with them. And but at the same time, the foreign countries were we are going to not supply nuclear fuel to India because they've tested a bomb, which we are against, right? And then they say that, so there's a debate that starts in India's nuclear program, whether we should involve these foreign suppliers, because they're asking unnecessary questions about contemplated end use. It is jeopardizing our efforts at technological self-reliance. This is the time that someone is differentiating self-reliance into technological self-reliance, and it happens across. So the 1970s is also a time, simultaneously there's another war going on in India's nuclear, scientific and technological sector. The 1970s is a time when there is stagflation, when there's the Arab oil embargo, and there is the first meeting on environment policy in Stockholm, right? How to think about environment and development. So India is getting a lot of, because there is a lot of protectionist policies in industrially advanced country. Now we had to be competent. We had to produce goods, not just invest in science, but now we have to go on to producing goods that will increase our commercial value in the international market. So people will opt for it in the international market despite the protectionist policies that the West is putting in. So and Indira Gandhi, Atmaram, PMS Blackett, who comes to review the scientific organization in India, all of them are shocked. What are we doing? There is no result for the money spent. Give me 3 minutes, I'll complete my argument. Yeah. So there's no result for the money spent, right? And they are saying that now we need technological competence. It's only technological, our scientists should be equal to the best, and only that means that they have to produce the goods, not just do scientific research. Science for science sake disappears, and they have to produce the goods. And and Atmaram, particularly the director of CSIR at that time, says that technological competence is key to economic self-reliance, and it is from economic self-reliance other self-reliances will follow. But when these differentiations are constantly happening, right, these modified displacement, partial reinscriptions are all constantly happening. But till even now today, historians of science like Janvi Falke would say that self-reliance is a synonym of technological self-reliance and economic self-reliance, although they both are coming from totally different tradition. One of them is saying that why we need to reinvent and rediscover economic self-reliance, why we need to reinvent and rediscover in the name of self-reliance. Why can't we just borrow from foreign countries? That is economic self-reliance. And technological self-reliance saying that we have to make everything in our country, because the companies are putting foreign companies are putting a lot of questions to us about our end use, right? And jumping on this, this was a two kind of conversation that is going on. So jumping on, this is also a time in the international order there was a lot of things going on because it is seen that development has not led to the self-reliant national development. The developmental paradigm has not led to self-reliant national development in post-colonial countries. So we have the Lima Declaration, we have the new international economic order, right? And this is where ecological self-reliance comes in. So the new international economic order says that trade relations in the world is very unfair. West has more control over the trade relations. So now that has undermined the self-determination of all people. And this you can see in the way that natural resources are exploited in abroad, in post-colonial countries. So we need to go back to self-reliance. That's what they are saying, right? But the foreign countries are getting erstwhile advanced countries are what are we doing with self-reliance? It means that you're not going to, be an open economy anymore. You're going to close yourself and stuff like that. So we have Tanzania, India and all organizing conference, and they say that self-reliance does not mean autarky. It doesn't mean total autonomy, or it doesn't mean total indigenous control, right? Self-reliance means that we benefit from mutual trade and cooperation. And this concept they borrow from Kokyok Declaration. And in Kokyok, this is the concept of self-reliance that goes on to justify why the Russian plant in Kodunkulam is a self-reliant plant. Okay, because the foreign dependence is for mutual benefits. It's going to give us mutual benefits, this cooperation. That's how they go on to justify, right?
No more time.
Okay. Okay, that is how we get the ecologically the notion of sovereignty over sovereignty over nations' resources is where in the Kokyok Declaration it goes on to build as eco-development, an ecologically sound socio-economic development. And in this system, I'll just finish it off. And in this system, technological Technological development is seen as is critical of instruments of oppression. Instead, advance those that benefited man and did not harm the environment. It advocated for new approaches to developmental styles that propelled imaginative research into alternative consumption patterns, technological styles, land use strategies, utilized labor towards the conservation of natural resources, enhancement of environment, and constrained resource absorbing and waste creating overconsumption patterns and ecologically disruptive technologies. And particularly it advanced delinking. So I'll finish it over there, but I can connect in questions how eco-development plays out in Kodunkulam. Thank you so much for the time. I'm so sorry to take more time.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Ayush Bhardwaj. Ayush. And I think the topic has already been
Please mind the time, we have another session.
Okay, let me start by saying how grateful I am to be part of this colloquium. I wrote this paper because I realized that modern-day democracies are marred by a plethora of socio-political-technological issues, and I think it is crucial to gauge the nature of these contemporary issues so that they can be overcome. Now, in an attempt to overcome human finitude, humanity invented technology. With the unfolding of historical time, technology has gotten better and smarter. Often we allow ourselves to indulge in the pretense that technological progress is equivalent to human progress. The rise of network communication, or the internet, and thereafter social media platforms set hopes for a techno-European future where the power to control the dominating narratives of society is not only limited to the state actors and that society's political elites. These techno-Europic hopes soon gave way to a gloomy reality where even the survival of democracy seemed obtruse. However, it is my belief that updating democratic form of government and its cherished ideals to fight the technological vagaries of our time is only way through and out of this techno-populist challenge. In this paper, I attempt to figure out what such a techno-democratic solution would entail. My paper is divided into 5 sections, and each section contains one crucial argument. Section 1. Tools of Transcendence. My first argument is that technology is a crucial site to start theorizing about politics. This argument rests on premises provided by French philosopher Georges Bataille in his 1973 book, Theory of Religion. Differentiating between immanence and transcendence, Bataille argues that the invention of technology and its mediation into human lives engendered subject-object relationships. The world without a positing human consciousness is also a world without things or objects. In a world inhabited only by animals, there is no discernible difference between the animals. Subordinating relations of power do not exist between the animals that eat other animals. When one animal eats another, that does not necessarily lead to an alteration of the fundamental situation. Every animal in this world is like water in water. Bataille defines animality as immediacy or immanence, or inability to transcend itself. In the absence of both objects and transcendence, the continuity is maintained. It is only through the positing of a tool that continuity of the animal world ruptures. The tool provides exteriority to the world. In the world of animality, the subject cannot subordinate other animals and plants of the world to which it shares a part. In the same vein, the subject cannot be subordinated by other elements of its world. But the tool is subordinated to the person who uses it. The process of tool making subordinates the tool to its end. Technologies are designed to be subservient to humans. Andrew Feinberg also believes that the idea behind the using of tools is to project power outward, on the world to change the world more than the actor. Much like Newton's third law of motion, which states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, every human action demands an equivalent reaction. But Bataille's interpretation of a tool leaves little room for reciprocal action. Feinberg argues that technical actions only appear to be non-Newtonian when the subject acts as a technological object. Only a disproportionately small amount of feedback is registered, and this is what causes the illusion of technology. The subject is oblivious to its connection to the technological object and believes itself to be autonomous, independent of the world in which it acts. Section 2. Tools of Enslavement. My second argument is that power relations in a capitalist system are not only product of human interpersonal relationships, but they are constituted by social machines, such as corporations, social and economic infrastructure of welfare state, communication system, and are assisted by technical machines such as algorithmic media. Machinic enslavement operating in capitalist societies incorporates people as individuals or divisible units, no longer capable of unity at the level of human person. The individual has been replaced by masses, samples, datasets, markets, or banks. Once the epistemological unity of the human body has been resolved, it opens up a whole new spectrum of possibility for the experience of freedom, dreams, desires, as well as regulation, subjugation, enslavement, and governance. The new biomedical and biometric technologies allow for the modification and rethinking of the post-human body, leading to the rise of transhumanism, new and better ways of profiling individuals and population, and commodifying nature. Now, due to the time constraint, I won't be discussing biomedical technologies. To start with biometric technologies, they rely on data gained from individuals' body parts for identification, verification, authentication of suspicious people. Marginalized groups are often the first to be subjected to new forms of biometric surveillance technology. African American scholar Simone Brown argues that the identity of the migrants in these digitizing instances can be understood dynamically through its construction within discourse. Brown borrows the concept of epidermal thinking from Paul Gilroy, who in turn is inspired by Frantz Fanon's idea of epidermalization. Fanon's concept of epidermalization is a way of thinking the ontological insecurity of the racial body as it experiences its being through others. What you are, what your identity is not determined by you, but it's dictated to you externally. That's epidermalization. So for Simone Brown, digital epidermalization is the exercise of power cast by the disembodied gaze of certain surveillance technologies, such as identity cards, whose effect is to alienate the subject by producing a truth about one's body and one's identity, irrespective of subject's claims. In the current citizenship regimen in India, citizenship is defined through the exclusion of the deemed other, the capital O other. The highly controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA, enacted in 2019 and put into effect in March of this year, expedites the process of obtaining Indian citizenship to all religions except the Muslims. Together, the CAA, NPR, NRC, these are tools of enumeration and epidermalization, which are resourcefully utilized by the national government to ascribe an identity onto the bodies of immigrants. At this point, I think it's crucial to take a look at the new way of identity construction that the BJP introduced through the CAA. In his 1994 book, CM Mapped, Thongchai Vinikul argues that nationhood is a cultural construct with the idea of nation defined through techniques of knowledge production. Nation and national are therefore ideas that are constantly contested and relatively defined. His main argument is that nation's geobody, its territory, practices, values, they're imagined to be discursively created for every time and era through a two-way process of negative and positive identification. Talking about his own country, Thailand, Thongchai argues that the essence of Thainess has been preserved to the present time, even when Siam has been modernized and changed completely in over a century by a process of identity construction called negative identification. In this process, what is not Thai is defined from time to time, whereas Thainess is never clearly defined. In this identity construction process, the emphasis is on the creation of otherness, focusing on differences, not on similarities. Similarly, the citizenship law not only seeks to grant citizenship, but it also defines who the citizens of the nation are through this negative identification. In the discursive formation of the new Indian identity, Muslims are intentionally excluded. The doubtful Muslim residents within the territorial boundaries of the nation, they're made to pass through a document verification process, failing which they would be either imprisoned or sent back to their home nation. This is a test whose subjects are exclusively the Muslim residents and immigrants. This is not a test of citizenship, this is a test of loyalty. In essence, this test achieves two purposes. A, it contests the existing Indian identity and redefines it through the exclusion of the other, with an emphasis on religious differences. B, it produces an epidermal experience for all the Muslim residents of India, irrespective of their citizenship status. It alienates them and makes them see themselves through the eyes of the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party as questionable, doubtful citizens of India. Section 3. Designing machines and repressive desublimation. Attaching meaning to things is how we as humans build conceptual maps to guide ourselves in the world. This process does not take place in isolation and requires constant communication to check the validity of our meanings. Canadian professor G. Langlois posits that search for meaning is continuous, and in this search, we open to the world and we let the world in. Meanings allow us to adopt culturally appropriate ways of living. The development of mass media as a tool of manipulation, available easily at the hands of those in power, showcases the significance of meaning for social and political control. The modern media, so-called social or participatory media, YouTube, Facebook, Wikipedia, and what was previously known as Twitter, are technologies that provide the material sites through which the relationship between signifying and making sense is shaped. Social media platforms are not only designed to mine meaningful data from the users, these are platforms which could be called meaning machines, assemblages of technological, human, cultural components that produce meaningfulness and meaninglessness. The interaction users have with these platforms contribute to the capitalist accumulation of data without producing any sense of alienation in the users. This is because the users experience a sense of satisfaction in exchange for their data. Langlois labels it psychosocial satisfaction. The satisfaction offered in exchange for the data mined from the users prompts the user to engage more with the platform. Platform technologies are designed to be participation oriented. Langlois' meaning machines function similar to the classical notion of ideological hegemony, where individuals accept and perpetuate their own exploitation due to the way they are embedded in the cultural and superstructural logic of meaning and meaningfulness. I use the paradigm of repressive desublimation developed by Makuza to understand the overall effect of social media on our democratic societies. But due to time constraint, I'll just make a short comment on it. Makuza recognized that contemporary industrial societies had developed a novel approach to neutralizing and absorbing forces of dissent and rebellion by embracing, commodifying, and transforming our deep, dark desires to rebel into profitable ventures. As a result, long hair, piercings, tattoos, rebellious attitudes, and works of art, which were previously associated with ways of self-expression for the outcasts, were turned into advertising and marketing tools, repeatedly featured in newspapers and magazines to sell soft drinks, clothes, cars, and perfumes. He calls this process repressive desublimation. The process of desublimation is repressive because it deprives previously repressed desires, fantasies, thoughts of their ability to disrupt and destabilize the socio-economic system. Section 4. The emergence of techno-populist state. Technocracy is not a theory of governance. It is an accompanying package of programs for governance that seem to suggest that certain managerial elites should be allowed to make changes to economy and society that they seem fit. On the other hand, populism is an ideology that presents the people as a morally good force and contrasts them against the elite who are portrayed as corrupt and self-serving. The contemporary understanding of populism is based on the work of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Laclau offers a theory of populism based more on form than on content. The people, which form the basis of all political action, are actualized through an empty signifier. This empty signifier is mutable, malleable, capable of associating itself with a whole range of socio-political causes. The Hindu populist strategically fill the empty signifier, that is the people, with Hindu majority, excluding the Muslims in its current iteration. The Christians and other religions are earmarked for the same exclusion at an uncertain but a definite future date. The Congress Party, with its secular and pluralist ideology, is made out to be perceived as the elite political other, which has allowed the Muslims to thrive in this country in its very many years of unobstructed rule. So, what is techno-populism? I define techno-populism as a synthesis of technocracy and populism. This is a mathematical expression that I use for it. Techno-populism equals technocracy plus populism. In techno-populist imagination of the political sphere, the solutions to complex societal and policy problems appear to be self-evident. Jeffrey Friedman argued that techno-populist perspective consists of three pillars. A tendency towards technocratic action, which is defined as taking instant action to address societal problems. B, technocratic voluntarism, which is the belief that strong willpower is essential for a leader to achieve socio-economic and political objectives. And C, a simplified understanding of societal or policy issues, where the success of solutions is directly linked to the policymaker's intention to resolve them, often relying on intention heuristics. So, a politician who is perceived to possess true technocratic voluntarism, public belief, and a strong drive to solve societal and policy problems is viewed through good intention heuristics. The public can safely assume that his policy deliberation will result in technocratic action. Section 5, Beyond Technocratic Futures, the ideal of techno-democracy. If the techno-populist state authoritatively advocates meanings and interpretations, techno-democracy as its rival form of government offers resistance to contemporary populism by empowering people to take charge of how they associate meaningfulness and meaninglessness to everyday objects, including technological objects and political objects. I use Alessandro Sancino and Peter Bloom's understanding of techno-democracy. They posit that techno-democracy consists of three separate but interrelated elements. A. It highlights the contingency or the changeable nature of the present social order. B. It emphasizes the instrumentality of technology to disrupt the contemporary social order to reveal a new high-tech political identity, that of smart democratic citizen. C. It is based on the governing fantasy that big data and other digital technologies could be put to use to hold corrupt political elites accountable to democratic norms and ideals. To conclude, techno-democracy is the ideological oppositional force to techno-populism. It is the ideal set against the growing totalitarian tendencies of techno-populist regime. It is not just a scaffolding holding the democratic structure in its place. It is a source of hope and creative imagination. Techno-democracy holds the revolutionary potential to change the very ways we govern ourselves. At the same time, techno-democracy allows us to rethink the applications and utilities of existing technologies so that we can transcend reality which is created by desiring machines and create our own meanings.
Thank you so much. Now I invite the third speaker, Sanjana. Yeah.
Please don't start. I have a PPT. Thank you. Alright, very good morning to everyone. Thank you to the organizers and also thank you to Ayush. You made my job a lot easier because I'll be starting from where you have ended. So to set the tone for my presentation and also place my presentation in a certain context, social media and democracy, and most of the studies exploring the relationship between the two, have largely focused on how social media has been used to develop collective actions, which Steenberg and Bennett and Steenberg have called connective action, the logic of connective action. Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street movement, At Home, India Against Corruption and Nirbhaya movement are all examples of how social media has been used to penetrate the democratic participation that has been imagined via social media. However, post-2015, that is the mid of 2010s, we also see that right-wing forces have started to appropriate the very domain of social media and have used social media, in fact, to propagate and proliferate their own message and extremist ideology that otherwise wouldn't have been possible in a usual offline liberal framework. So this is where I begin with my presentation, which is titled Digital Hindutva, the Symbolic Construction of Majoritarian Identity on Social Media by the Indian Right. To begin with, the structure of my presentation is as follows. I begin by asking three broad questions, and then I make three propositions that are based on those questions. I present my central argument, and then I discuss social media and the Hindu right to offer my own model of digital Hindutva. The second part of my presentation is focused on the case study, which is to explore the Hindutva alt-right in India and how the memification of Hindutva has happened. That cannot be done without taking into account an event that happened, which is Sully Deals and Bully by Rose. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, but I hope after the presentation you are. And then I move on to the discussion and finally conclude my presentation. Okay. So the very first question, and of course as the title of the panel itself suggests, is on relationship between technology and democracy, but also to ask how social media impacts democratic imagination, renegotiates democratic spaces, but also subverts those very structures. And these questions cannot be asked without understanding the notion of political participation and autonomy. The second question is a lot more narrower and focused on technopolitics in India, which looks at how technology has been used by the right-wing forces to pursue their own political goals, looking at the interplay of technology and political agency. I also look at social media as a site of construction of political subjectivity and identity and the performance of those very symbolic identity. I also look at social media as a site for propaganda, which blurs the lines between state and society, though that is not the focus of my presentation here, but in future I do aim to look at this relationship. The third question is what situates my paper with the global literature on far-right communication, which is that how social media has emerged as a common denominator in the surge emerge of global right-wing movements across the globe. Moving on to the three propositions that I make, social media, it has been a tool for radicalization. And I look at this by looking at the very architecture or the very making of social media in itself, which Dana Boyd and Kakavan talk about as affordances of social media. There are many affordances, 6 affordances that are there, which includes connectivity, shareability, persistence, replicability, and also identifiability. We can take that up while discussions. But what I also conceptualize is that social media acts as an echo chamber where individuals often subscribe to their views and ideologies that they hold true, and therefore they will be more exposed to those similar kinds of ideology, thereby strengthening their prejudices. Carl Sunstein calls this cyber polarization, which is strengthening of their own prejudices. I also look at the second side of social media and radicalization, which is that of techno-populism that Ayush has already mentioned. But I look at the demand side of populism, which is to say that when audience begins to speak in the language of the populace themselves. Because majority of the work that has happened on social media and Hindutva or Hindu nationalism has focused on how Prime Minister Modi, or there's been a rebranding of Narendra Modi, an excellent paper by Jarjit Pal that looks at how the populace has used social media, but my paper focuses on the demand side of it. The second proposition that I'm making is of technopolitics of Hindutva 2.0, which is to ask that if the Hindu right has really changed, and there have been many studies that have confirmed that Hindutva has necessarily changed in its strategies and the way it moves, and therefore I fundamentally argue that through the use of social media, Hindutva has altered the very terrain of Indian politics, mainstreaming the ideology that has been facilitated and expedited by a compulsive and creatively destructive use of social media. The third proposition is that social media as a site of identity construction allows the Hindu right wing to construct a symbolic majoritarian Hindu identity, and in the performance of these identities and subjectivities, there's also a normalization of violence that goes on, which impacts communal sense-making in the everyday. The central argument, therefore, is that social media has become Hindu right-wing's main tool to create and generate symbolic scripts that is representative of their narrative in producing and popularizing those narratives, thereby manufacturing a majoritarian consensus to both legitimize and normalize violence. And in the exercise of this identity, the Hindu majority comes to understand itself as a Hindu through the violence that it carries out on the minority. This is the framework that I'm going to begin with, which is that of digital Hindutva. So to understand symbolic Hindu majoritarian identity, you can understand it as a flip side, side A and side B. The side A of the majoritarian identity focuses on generation of a Hindu solidarity or a collective sense belonging that it offers, but also on the flip side, there's a dramatized and ritualized vilification of the Muslim other that generates and strengthens prejudices. I use the concept of normalization of violence given by Irm Halim, and she talks about that repeated acts of violence are no longer viewed as immoral but as necessary and ordinary. And she gives 3 axes of how normalization of violence takes place: that of moralizing, popularizing, and also legalizing violence. I focus on the first 2, and the third one is not on the purview of my paper. Moralizing violence comes when violence is framed as divine and necessary, and popularizing happens when it is carried out in the name of the people, and therefore creating a majoritarian consensus. Now, another framework that I borrow from her, which is extremely important, is that we have all heard about WhatsApp lynchings that happen when social media results in lynchings itself, but it is not necessary every time that violence on social media necessarily translates into the offline and the physical realm. And therefore, to account for the violence on the side of digital media itself is extremely important, which is why I borrow the concept of metaphysical violence, which talks about the intangible and non-physical form of violence that happens through language and iconography. The next slide begins with the 2 sides of this one. I don't have time, so I think I'm just going to skip this. And I move on to introducing the frame of digital Hindutva. I've already mentioned this. I'm going to go to the working model that is there. So I have identified 4 ways in which Hindutva right-wing mobilization is trying to capture the space of social media, which is that of manipulation of history, misinformation and disinformation, memes, music and other art forms, which are 4 M's. I will be focusing on the 3rd M, which is that of memes, and therefore coming on to the memification of Hindutva. I take up the case study of Sully Deals and Bully Buy app, in which in the month of July in 2021, almost 100 Muslim women found themselves and their profiles uploaded on the internet, where certain Hindu right-wing men claiming to be traditionalists and not belonging to any political party though, were conducting fake auctions. And these Muslim women were prominent authors, prominent journalists, and also the mother of a missing student, as we know, Najib. We also have Bully by app, which was created in 2021 of December. So while Sully Deal's app was not, the creators of Sully Deal app were not arrested or found. Of Bully by apps, they were arrested but also granted bail, citing that they were first-time offenders and therefore should be released. This wasn't the first attempt of conducting fake auctions of Muslim women. These are the cover pictures of the app. In fact, selling Muslim women as deals of the day also happened over Twitter by a handle called @SullyDeals101, which Hasiba Amin has noted, who was herself a victim. On 13th May 2021, a YouTube channel called Liberal Doji with 87,000 subscribers ran an Eid special that hosted a live virtual auction of Muslim women, rating women, their body shaming them and bidding them for 5 or 10 rupees. Describing sexual acts and issuing rape threats. Again, I don't have time to look at the audience responses, but of course, if the discussion comes up, I can. Moving on to how the right-wing groups presented Sully Deals and Bully by apps as just a prank and a harmless joke. And these are the memes that are that I found while conducting a digital ethnography for almost 3 months. I'm so sorry, the images are pretty wild and explicit. Now moving on to the discussion of Sully Deals and Bully by apps. The memification of Hindutva should not be seen as an isolated event. It's not something that has just propped up suddenly, but rather something that has grown over for the past decade with the constant trolling and state-sponsored trolling, in fact, of activists, journalists, and authors, and who have been prominent critics of the government. This trolling has allowed the audiences to also consider it as okay and doable in a democracy, thereby curbing dissent. This result of state-sponsored trolling then also problematizes the relationship between Hindutva alt-right groups and state, and thereby moving on to the way alt-right groups in the American counterpart. Now, here I am trying to link Hindutva alt-right group with the larger far-right groups. In the American context, alt-right groups existed before populist resurgence of Trump. But in India, however, alt-right groups have specifically grown in the past 5 years or so, which is after populism. And therefore, we see that there's a direct link between populism, techno-populism, as well as the growth of Hindutva alt-right. The second point that I come to is that the Indian alt-right or the Hindutva alt-right is exclusively online phenomena, similar to how alt-right groups have been in the American and the European counterpart. The constitution of the Hindutva alt-right is that most of the members of these groups are upper caste men aged between 18 to 25, and they do not claim to overtly belong to any political party or right-wing outfit, but actively believe in Hindutva ideology. Similar to the alt-right groups in the West, they are active supporters of the government and the right-wing party at the political helm. It also brings us to the fault lines in Hindutva that have emerged over the past decade, that though the Indian alt-right does seem to have similarities with extreme right-wing groups, there are certain differences. So the Hindutva alt-right is divided into 2 groups, which is that of traditionalists and the Raitas. Raitas being the actual sour dish. But traditionalists and Raitas both together aim for a Hindu Rashtra. But the routes that they take are extremely different. And Alishan Jafri and Naomi Barton's work was extremely useful in this regard. The traditionalists espouse for misogyny, caste-based violence, and also openly call for genocide against minorities as the only viable method for making India into a Hindu nation. The Raitas, on the other hand, who are seen as soft Hindutvas by the traditionalists, see that legislative and policy making are the only 2 avenues to make India a Hindu nation. Benjamin Mock also notes that a section of the alt-right group Yeah, I'll finish it. Thank you. Also mentions that traditionalists do not favor the right-wing populist leader Narendra Modi. In fact, they believe that he is too soft on Muslims, and therefore also have referred to him as Maulana Modi. Coming to trolling, most of the women on Sully Deals and Bully Bhai apps who were trolled were largely Muslim women who were active critics of the government, and therefore Martha Nussbaum also notes that online misogyny is deeply connected to shame punishment as an attempt to bring down women and have power over them. I move on to the next part of the discussion, which is how Pepe, as some of you might know, Pepe is a neo-Nazi figure, and in Germany, used in Germany, but he's gotten Hindutvaized, has also gotten a Savarkar makeover, and is also at the site of Babri Masjid demolition. So Pepe, being Hindutvaized here, also talks about how memes are malleable symbols and have certain textual flexibility that Rob Jenkins has called a spreadable media. The alt-right is also using, this was by the way, a Nazi propaganda poster that was completely reconfigured and was posted by Swati Singh, who was one of the accused in the Bully Bhai apps case. We also come to the languages, the online codes and languages that Hindutva alt-right has developed. They have used K2O, K2UA, Chuslims, Sully and Bully, all which are extremely derogatory terms used for Muslims. And lastly, the point on weaponizing humor and irony. I think this cannot be highlighted a lot more emphatically, that by using humor and irony, not only are the right-wing groups today, like in the contemporary moment, disarticulating themselves with a very aggressive understanding of, in American context, white nationalism, as Hartzell would argue, or in Indian context with Hindutva, as I would like to put forward, that by disarticulating whiteness, or in this context, a majoritarian identity of Hindus, they try to present the majority community as the disadvantaged and the victims, and thereby using jokes to deflect any criticism and expand the scope of what is acceptable and not acceptable in a liberal democracy. The right presents a critique of liberal values, secularism, that have in the past supposedly burdened the Hindu majority to tolerate the minorities and others despite being in such large numbers. These activists not only derive pleasure but also attach a larger sense of purpose by sacralizing and moralizing their duties as civilizational Hindu warriors. Like most of the profile pictures that I found while collecting data was that of a masculine Shiva as the profile picture of these documents, or a angry Hanuman. All of these were the profile pictures of them. So to finally conclude my presentation, we are the largest democracy and we pride ourselves on that. We also have the largest Muslim minority. Such radicalization on an everyday basis, and everyday communalism, as Amogdhar notes, is extremely dangerous to proceed further with our democracy in India. But also the fact that social media has been able to draw these connections and transnationalizations and draw convergences between right-wing extremist movements, not only in the West, but also in the so-called global South through India. And finally, the theoretical model that I've offered of digital Hindutva attempts to build on a lot of literature that has been there previously on right-wing social media, but to look at how exactly is the process that's going on. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now I invite the discussant, Vidushi.
Good morning to everyone present. I would first like to thank the organizers for having me as a discussant for the panel. I think we had very interesting 3 presentations which discussed wonderfully the creator-critical relationship between technology and democracy. While a general understanding on technology is usually associated positively with the idea of progress and democratic participation, all the 3 works discussed today have appropriately problematized this dominant view that technology always means progress. Beginning with the first presentation by Dr. Ali, which explores the I think, historical and epistemic frameworks that influence India's idea on eco-development and sustainability and self-reliance, where today's reworked notion of Atmanirbhar Bharat is actually quite reliant on foreign country, and the Gandhian notion of self-reliance of total autonomy is now completely concealed over. I think it gives a refreshing perspective and a much needed critique of the country's approach to self-reliance and the impact of colonial history on the approach, especially in the context of nuclear development and techno-scientific practices, and calls for a rather holistic understanding of self-reliance, one that includes ecological balance and justice. And the presentation also made a very important emphasis on the need to decolonize sustainability by recognizing indigenous and ecological forms of knowledge that already traditionally exist among our society. And the techno-scientific determinism can be resisted against through those traditionally existent knowledge systems. Moving on to the second, which is quite a meaningful discussion on the implications of technology and social media. Broadly speaking, I think the presentation made an important intervention regarding how technology shapes human desires, meaning making, and democratic processes in which modern technology, through surveillance and algorithms and digital manipulation, represses critical thinking and reduces human individuality, leading to humans becoming mere data points within the larger systems of control. The presentation also discussed how technology, with decisions being made using supposedly impartial data, furthers populist political goals. Social media has made it easier for populist leaders to communicate directly with people bypassing the traditional democratic institutions. And I think another point which the presentation made was about how biometric technologies associated with the CA are being used to alienate marginalized groups by producing a truth about their identities without considering their lived experiences. And I think similar points were made in the third presentations regarding the marginalization of minority community. From discussing the importance of decolonizing the broader developmentalist understanding of technology, which ends up excluding indigenous knowledge systems, and then the algorithmic governance of meanings and desires, and technological production of truth about identities, which exclude and alienate marginalized minorities. The third presentation in the panel discusses how humor as a tool through memes has become a crucial medium for propagating and normalizing extremist ideology. I think the last presentation of the panel highlights the performative and radicalizing function of social media. Memes in particular circulated through Sulli Labs, which digital Hindutva uses effectively to construct a majoritarian Hindu identity in opposition to minorities, especially Muslims, which can normalize and trivialize violence against them. On social media, I think it has become too normal and common to use humor to propagate the most extremist and prejudiced views, and they dangerously create an environment where it is expected of the people consuming such content to take it rather lightly, well, because it's humor, so take it lightly. And therefore, I think the last presentation by Sanjana on humor and using memes as a radicalizing tool makes a very important emphasis on how humor and politics work together to mask and legitimize extremist views, similar to strategies used by far-right groups globally. And with that, I'd like to conclude my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I thank all the three presenters for their very insightful presentations, and the discussion. Now the floor is open for comments and suggestions or questions. Yeah, please introduce yourself.
I'm Ritvik Trivedi, PhD scholar from University Department. I want to ask this your presentation on this Hindutva. Like, do you see normally people, as you said, that the problem which is taking place by the government or people who support the version of government. So do you think that it is also representing the Hindu psyche, their insecurity? Because I was reading a lot of articles and a lot of papers on this Bangladesh crisis. So in a way, do you think that it is reflecting the psyche or like the nervousness or the kind of emotions which they have with the kind of secular model which I speak to many people to say that the mainstream parties, the secular model has been too much on the side of the minorities. But when it comes to the Hindu psyche, they feel that they're being a majority and their issues or their concerns are not being effectively raised. But with the advent of the right, with the BJP RSS, they think that psychologically there is a party like for us, because the Congress and the mainstream parties, they are representing, they're more on the side of the minorities or particularly the Muslims and Christians. But with us, like when I speak to such people, then they say that it is psychologically, it is representing our will. So like what they are, as you're pointing out this, the social media, the memes and all, they are circulating. So in a way, there is an kind of endorsement for such kind of what I think there is an endorsement for such kind of things, because they see that it is representing the will or the psyche, the Hindu psyche, and in a way it seems that they have been defeated. Like the mainstream parties are more on the minority side, and they will not be adequately represented. Being an effective majority in a country like India, they will not be adequately represented. But with the BJP or with in power, so yeah. So what is your own understanding about this?
Thanks. I think we can collect some questions, then you can respond. Yeah.
To Sanjana's presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and it was very comprehensive, and kudos to that. But then I also have two major things that I wanted to point out in that, is that when we talk about violence, moralizing, you mentioned, right? Moralizing violence and another sort of violence. So when we talk about violence, when we are in social networking platforms, we are also talking about speech. So we are talking about hate speech here. So the argument given by Ray Langton and Jeremy Waldron is like speech, Ray Langton says that it's not just transmission of your words, but it also has the capacity to harm you. So now we are looking at things within the screen, like, we are documenting sort of thing. But the important aspect is to go to the psychological level, that what harm is it promoting. So when we are talking about violence, and when we are talking about digital violence, social networking sort of a violence, hate speeches, it's also important, to go a step forward and talk to the individuals that are being affected by them, right? And following that, my second question, like, this is my comment, but my question is to Sanjana, that you talked about minority, right? And from your presentation, what I could get is that you're talking about Muslim minorities, right? But the social networking platform is also a space of upper caste hegemony, right? And you mentioned about caste-based violence. What I could get is that you're talking about Muslim minorities. So if that's the case, why did you choose Muslim minority if that's the case? So thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yeah, Dhananjay.
Thank you so much for. Sorry, my throat is done. I won't be. 2-3 queries regarding all presentations. They were very, very interesting. Do we see complete disjuncture between episteme and techne? I mean, which are the normal categories available to understand democracy and technology? If we are seeing that, then the technology should be outrightly rejected, even for the empowerment purposes. And second is regarding Sanjana's presentation. Are we also witnessing suspension of moral or political and assertion of caste glories defining minority and gender roles on social media? And this aspect cannot be ignored, that the caste glories have become a very vantage point when you define otherness, I mean, in the name of many things. And to Ms. Iria, self-reliance is, Gandhi is not in cultural sense, but being human sense was a very important contribution. What state has done since 1947, that using self-reliance in a cultural sense, not in a human sense. And the other important way could be to come to self through other. So do you see this as an impossible hypothesis in new liberalism? Because in new liberalism, how do you see other to self? Because itself is the goal of neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Parth, and I would like to have a question with Dr. Ali in regards to your presentation. You mentioned about eco development and sustainable development. I would love to explore a bit more on that understanding. Thank you.
So my question is to Sanjana. Congratulations on the presentation, first of all. Now, extending your paper a bit, I'd like to ask you, do you observe any specific differences between the digital and, say, analog Hindutva, non-digital Hindutva, or is it merely an expansion of the ideology to a new creative sphere?
Yes, thank you. I'm Ananta Kumar Giri. So, Sanjana, in terms of your very fascinating presentation, but also what gets presented is a very monolithic construction. Though you point to a little bit of contestation like Maulana Modi, which is an invitation for realizing the inner, fractures that are happening. What are the lines of these fractures? Secondly, the social media space is not just a closed space. Now, what kind of challenges to this vilification has happened from different actors? Hinduism is not Hindutva. Thirdly, I just bring this phrase, as you talk about digital Hindutva, what might be the dynamics of interaction with the divine Hindutva? Digital and the divine via categories like political theology. And how that political theology, as it is being constructed, it also has very interesting kind of inner fractures as well as relational contestations.
Please.
I'm Mallikarjun from IIT Delhi. I had one question open to the entire panel. That is, what is the notion of democracy that functions as a normative ideal for the entire discussion? The second is to Sanjana and Ayush. This techno-democracy versus techno-populism or social media used for particular political ends. Is there any proposal that you make, because the means are the same to do the good and the bad, so are we ready to sacrifice the means by any chance? Third, for Misia, I would like to know how you cash out what you have built in your example. And the fourth is a comment adding to Professor Giri's, that tradition, like in Sanjana's presentation, is there a danger that we strawman what tradition means and then further entrench the same entities, because tradition in philosophy of Perennis is a very different kind of meaning of tradition. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm John. Thank you for all of you for the wonderful presentations. There is a notion called memory of the future. There is a notion called memory of the future. Looking at, especially Sanjana's presentation, at all of you, what kind of a future are we kind of constructing from what is going on? What happened to the moral sentiment? One of the first economic book is actually on moral sentiment. Are we losing the moral sense? And what is the response of the public? And the question has already come. Why is that there is not enough anger? Anger is not something bad. Prophetic anger, I mean, in the larger society, is that manifestation of the culture itself, not having enough anger responses, and so that we can direct, I'm thinking of the 7 social sins of Gandhi. and the first one is about politics. So, I will leave it open. What kind of a future are we creating at the present moment? The memory of the future.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Saxena. First of all, I would like to say that it was a wonderful presentation by all of you. My question is for Sanjana again. Sanjana, you mentioned about manufacturing consent. So my question is a little theoretical, that generally when we talk about manufacturing consent, we have discussed about the press, the traditional media, and public opinion. So how do you see the tangible linkage between the social media and the public opinion? Do you see any further challenges in it? How it is leading the media's role in formation of a public opinion? In a democratic nation state, how do you see it as in the present, related to your presentation? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think technology is the only system which can bring equal opportunity for the society. It is believed that the rest of this, whether it's a parliamentary system or a media or other opportunities, are not giving equal opportunities. Technology which will bring equal opportunity for all. So to what extent it is successful in India?
This is Raj Kumar from Vidyajyoti College of Theology. I greatly appreciate all the three presentations, wonderful, thought-provoking. And I would like to draw our attention towards the bigger umbrella picture today is technology and democracy. And democracy, in a way, tends to have a way of the majority. So, but on the other hand, we also have an Indian tradition, Satyameva Jayate. So does technology in some way help us to discover the truth? How can truth be a factor that would define our democracy? Not just merely big numbers that matter. On the other hand, truth that matters. How does that technology help us in that direction? Secondly, the epistemic direction of technology. Technology, does it also help us develop a true knowledge? Or just we get carried away by the illusions and deceptions that help technology. So therefore, I would like to listen to you all on that. Thank you.
I think, could you please be brief, because we have to wind up and next session will start at 12 o'clock. Yeah, please.
I think I will take from where Father left off. One suggestion to Sanjana, you mentioned in passing, or everyone is speaking so fast, that about metaphysical violence. That was your suggestion to explain digital whatever. I was wondering whether you would consider virtual violence, because metaphysical violence is far more foundational, and it would mean that we started with the foundations of the universe as destructive foundations. So that was one. Just moving from there, a brief comment. As Father said, I think the social sciences have become more and more obsessed with the reality as the truth. So we are, carried away by what is happening around us. But what is the truth about that? So if we remind ourselves about, Gandhiji's comment on this Catherine's documentation of the dirt and filth in India, that he said, this is the report of a drain inspector, not about the truth of India. So I think the responsibility of the soil, you are very young, but all of you and your presentations were definitely interesting, but I think our responsibility as people from the university is that we look at the truth. Otherwise, how else can we counter what is happening? This thing that Father John also talked about, that there is a memory for the future that we need to carry ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Abhimati. I'm from third year pursuing B.Honors Political Science from Delhi University. So my question is that people speaking up for themselves is definitely a crucial component of democracy, but has social media also created a culture where people only speak against atrocities when there is a major crime, turning it into a trend rather than a cause for concern or pressure? For example, when the hideous crime in Kolkata happened, then people started speaking again and bringing feminist points forward. But other times when people speak up, they are called as pseudo-feminist or called names. And another example is when AI-generated images of all eyes on Gaza was being circulated. For that, we saw that there was also counter images of other people bringing that now all eyes on Hindus in Bangladesh, etc. So, is technology now a medium for genuine exchange of ideas and opinions, or has it only evolved as a channel for the dissemination of skewed and incomplete information? Is my question.
This should be the last question.
Actually, there's a tea break also, and we have to begin the next session and sharp at 12. Thank you.
Yeah, quick question to Ayush. How do you conceptualize techno-democracy when the algorithms and the capitalist framework behind those digital technologies are very highly biased? So how do you conceptualize techno-democracy?
Okay, last question, Manindra. Yeah. Please.
Very simple question, I think. One that I was just wondering, taking on the question of the caste and technology, this idea of populism, what does it miss out? Sometimes I feel that it is an intellectual laziness of Indian intellectuals that they borrow this term populism to define what is happening in India. Something more is happening probably. We miss out two things. One, the anxiety of different kinds of people, and in that they are using technology. So probably technology is also playing a role of ideology, and technology also becoming a site of contestation and site of struggle. So all kinds of groups are using that. It's not only Hindutva is using it, all kinds of groups are using it. So in that case, how does democracy, how do you democratize technology? That's one thing. And second, on the self-reliance, I think it never meant that you remain within yourself. I put an iron curtain. Self-reliance probably always meant that you have to privilege your own resources when you are interacting with anybody else. Don't be dependent on anybody else. That's the only thing. So, Swachh Bharat, sorry, not Swachh Bharat, the other thing is Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think, is an ideological statement. It's a political gimmick that the state, that the government is playing in order to give a sense of pride that we are doing it. It's definitely not Gandhian. But how does it have contradictions within itself? Like the movement that was led by RSS for long, self-reliance movement, or what they call it in Hindi, something. So that movement also collapsed very easily. So is there something there in that concept which we are not capturing that Gandhi was talking about? And is that still relevant in times of neoliberal economies?
Thank you so much for your very important questions. I think now over to the panelists. I think most of the questions are addressed to Sanjana, so shall we start with you?
So I'll begin first with Manindra sir's question. So, of course, I mean, we can have a longer debate over it because the idea of populism simply being borrowed from the West, I agree with you that sometimes we have to look at, not sometimes actually, we have to look at the nuances in the Indian context as well. And which is the reason why I was also trying to problematize this whole understanding of far-right communication with respect to the global movement as well. Because most of the work on far-right communication has happened on the Western sense, but not in the Indian sense. So we have to understand the nuances there. How do we democratize technology, and do other groups as well use populism as a concept? And I agree with that. That's why I started my presentation by talking about India against corruption or other social movements that have actually used technology. And I completely believe, also to answer to many other questions that were coming about how technology. Yeah.
In fact, 2024 election proves that it can be used by anybody actually.
So yeah, the next example was that how Dhruv Rathi's video that circulated so much actually changed the whole tide of elections. But also about contesting truths, the questions that come. I completely agree that social media has been used to create certain alternate realms of truth. So there are many truths now, which is why also misinformation, the whole idea of that comes in, because we don't know what is real, and it's very difficult to also understand what is the truth and what is not the truth. And the whole idea of Abki Baar 400 Baar in the current elections versus the results of the elections themselves were pretty contrasting. So how do we then look at electoral campaign and social media as well? Then coming on to the construction of coming to Veerwali ma'am's question on metaphysical violence and virtual violence, I will look into that, ma'am, and I'd like to talk more about it as well. Then the question that was posed by Abhimati on social media sensationalizing certain cases selectively, I completely agree with that. There is a politicization that happens on both spectrums, of course, and the larger argument of the paper was also about how, through the use of social media, to use Chantal Mouffe's terms, of how productive agonisms that are required in a democracy is being turned into pure antagonisms, right? So the whole all eyes on Raza meme is again an example of how memes are extremely malleable and can be used in different contexts, to answer to that. Then moving on to John's question on memory of the future and what kind of future are we constructing. I personally feel at the moment social media is constructing an extremely dystopian future for us, and I would love to be proven wrong. But I also feel that social media is the site where we can reimagine democracy, and that's why the very first question that I had was on the broad question. One of the first questions that I asked was, how do we see democratic imagination, democratic negotiation, and also to subvert the very structures that are in turn actually subverting the democratic structures. Then coming on to the question of manufacturing consent and public opinion and social media. Yeah. So I look at social media not as an individual entity. It is in fact in constant conversation with the mainstream media. So there is this hybridity of media. But I'm looking at how social media is also being particularly weaponized in certain senses, which mainstream media cannot. So for instance, you cannot talk about the kind of news that I showed. I'm sure that cannot be circulated on mainstream media, right? So I'm not trying to make social media, not trying to look at it very separately, but also how it's constantly interacting with mainstream media. Then the question on by Alok on observing the difference between technological Hindutva and offline Hindutva. Yes, that's why I feel like the concept of digital Hindutva is important to understand how this nuance and how this, the difference is there definitely. I don't think without social media, that was the very first argument of the paper as well, that without social media, the kind of populist majoritarian turn that India has taken and the way we've arrived at here after a decade would not have been possible without social media, and I strongly believe in that. The other question by Anand sir on fault lines of Hindutva and social media spaces and challenges, digital and divine category. Again, I think I'll have to think more about it and we could talk probably. Manikarjan's question on notion of democracy as a normative ideal, that was open to all the panels, so I would like Ayush and Ms. Riya to speak about it, but of course I can do it over tea. Then coming on to techno-populism, and if counter to populism is also useful through the very technology. I have already mentioned that I do see the opposition also coming in that. Now coming to the final question that was there on Hindu psyche is being reflected, I completely agree with that. There is a majoritarian anxiety, it is there of course, but the way it is being projected and the way it's being articulated is extremely violent and exclusionary on the minorities, and I would include here caste minorities as well. There's an interesting paper on ontological security and Hindutva. You could probably go through that to understand it. And Luke Mann has a very interesting article, Avijal, to your question on how, and also to Sir your question, that how the psychology is represented in the people. Psychosocial explanations are extremely important. My paper, my paper does not focus on that, but the psychosocial explanations in Luke Mann's article on alt-right pop pipeline, you can read that, and of course we can discuss it over tea. On the caste question, we'll discuss it over tea, so I'm going to close there.
Thank you so much. Ms. Priya, would you like to respond?
Briefly, yeah. So actually episteme and techne is co-produced. Like episteme become also tools in a technological society, right? So that is the first response. And in terms of how am I cashing out, that also applies to whether self is possible. The self is ecologically constituted. So to that extent, recovering those ecological articulation in Gandhi might be, useful. And also in Kokyok Declaration, where I ended the presentation, right? They argue for an eco-development, which basically what I call as ecological self-reliance. They say that we have to constitute an ocean body to manage the ocean resources. And I see an ocean body should only be managed with fishermen. Because the people in Kudankulam are asking this question. When I went to the nuclear power plant, environmental technologists there is saying that it's good that the Kudankulam is located in this locality because the wind is blowing from north to south. So whenever there's a radiation release at all, if there is, it will come and settle in the sea. And the Kudankulam people ask, to whom does sea belong? We have a knowledge about the sea that is unparalleled. And you think that, as city person, that the fish that we fish are affecting our bodies only. But the fish actually travels across the world. We know these migration patterns. Nobody can say whether the fish is a Fukushima fish or a Edinburgh fish. So what they are noting to is their knowledge. The democratic struggle is always a struggle for epistemes, plural, multiple knowledges. So in that sense, that's where, you see the Kudankulam power plant taking the sustainability route. We are going to reduce the emission, we are going to reduce the hot water that is being discharged, the temperature of it. And you see the fishermen on the other hand, who are saying that our life revolves around the sea. And you can ignore it thinking that you're not eating that fish, but you are. You don't know where the fish are. We have an understanding of the migration patterns. And that is basically what they are saying, right? And why do we not value these knowledges? We don't value these knowledges because we've already decided that the general public are not important to atomic energy, right at the initial rate. So self-reliant nuclear India is already epistemically violent. And it is only epistemic violent to the extent that it keeps democratic relations outfit. Democracy is not there. And when the democracy doesn't mean to take every voice, that will lead to populism. Democracy means the constitution of the self that you were, kind of saying. The anger against injustices, all of this should constitute a self that can live in an Anthropocene where we realize radiation and chemicals enter our waterways, our body, through biocapillaries of power, through these micro processes of power that enters into things, and we cannot see these processes of power precisely because we are doing epistemic injustice. Because of the notion that we believe we are epistemically inadequate, which is a colonial notion we imbibe, right? And I did not want only one point, and I did not say that we have already indigenous knowledges to question this, to respond to the discussion. I don't believe Hindu philosophy can stop, the violence of neoliberalism or capitalism or any of that. We need to think about it. We need to think about using all kinds of spiritualities that there are, all kinds of anger that there are, all kinds of emotions that there are to stop the kind of injustices that are like multiplying over social injustices that already exist, which my co-panelists wonderfully presented about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ayush, 1 minute.
Okay, let me quickly respond. I think there were two questions, one from Mallikarjun and another question asking me how do I conceptualize techno-democracy. I think what is most significant about techno-democracy is that we need to reimagine the utility and application of the base technology. I think this is what Mallikarjun mentioned, that the means remains the same. The basic technologies are there. Then how do we rethink democracy? Right? This will happen through rethinking of the tools, through a rethinking of the tech that we have. I think I also suggest for radical democracy, radical techno-democracy, which is the idea that all the government institutions should go for total transparency. I know it's very difficult to imagine that in our country where the Right to Information Act it now lies dysfunctional, but I think this could be done.
Okay, thank you so much. I thank all the panelists, Mr. Ayush, Sanjana, and for raising very important issues and relating to technology and democracy versus technological populism, self-reliance in cultural sense or human sense, interdependence, manufacturing consent, social media or public opinion, digital Hindutva, caste and technology becoming, site of contestation, and many other critical issues. So thank you so much, and I thank all the distinguished participants for your very important